Hi, good morning, everyone. We're keen to kick off on time this morning, so it's lovely to see everybody here. Oh, and the lights are going up. Here we go. So pleased to see everyone here this morning for the third keynote of the conference. I'm Angela Goddard from Griffith University and Chair of University Art Museums Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land in which we're gathering here this morning, their elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are here joining us this morning in person and online. Now, University Art Museums Australia is thrilled to have supported today's keynote by Associate Professor Gumillya Baker. I think it's really fitting that a practicing artist and one who has worked so intensively with museum collections and the Academy is rounding out these last few days of stimulating and provocative keynotes from three strong First Nations women. Myself and my colleagues from University Art Museums across the country are deeply inspired by the transformative power and potential of artists working in our universities and museums with our students and audiences, as well as our collections. Now, Associate Professor Gumillya Baker is a Mirning woman from the Nullarbor on the west coast of South Australia. She's a visual artist, performer, filmmaker, and a member of the Unbound Collective, which brings together 4 Aboriginal artists, activists, and academics. She's Associate Professor at Flinders University, and her areas of research interest include colonial archives, memory, photographic agency, and intergenerational transmission of knowledge. And in 2023, Ali's one of creative directors for the Australian Pavilion at the Venice Architectural Biennale and performed as part of this year's Tarawara Biennial with the Unbound Collective. Please join me in welcoming Ali.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, my computer just went to sleep. Hello everyone, good morning. I want to acknowledge this beautiful Gadigal country and peoples and the incredible social and political and cultural weight carried in this place, and how Gadigal have so deeply shaped my understandings at various times in my life, which I will acknowledge throughout today's talk. I also want to acknowledge and thank the conference organisers for inviting me to speak and caring for me, and I feel very humbled to be here. I want to acknowledge the other speakers, in particular Jennifer Barrett, whose address I missed unfortunately, and Gay Skolthorpe's address on collections and uncomfortable truth-telling yesterday, and the amazing work being done by and with the Noongar Aboriginal community in relation to the Carol artwork and collaborations with Scotland, which I saw yesterday as well, in particular the discomfort and anti-racist praxis, something which all of the Unbound Collective are deeply committed to. I was moved to listen to these conversations yesterday, and I want to acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous peoples in the room, as well as my family and community and deadly collaborators. You can see up here images that were taken in 2013 and 2014, right at the beginning of when I started collaborating performatively with my sister colleagues and deadly community friends. So we can see this is called Sovereign Fleet, and it was around the time that Tony Abbott had this sovereign borders, and I was doing an exhibition and thinking about sovereign fleets and ships, and I made these hats to perform an exhibition of photographs with the late Wiradjuri artist Ian Wilding, and we sailed into the gallery. But it also reminds me of this country in particular. In 1988, my mother and auntie, Auntie Irene Watson, took my brother and cousin and I on buses with many, many community members in the Long March for Justice, Freedom and Hope, a bus and car convoy that converged in Sydney on Gadigal country from all parts of what is now called Australia. And somehow, without mobile phones or the internet, our elders managed to connect us all, and we joined together and drove as a 10-kilometre continuous snake of cars and buses with banners and flags into Sydney to protest the 200-year occupation. We camped at La Perouse and were hosted by the community here with thousands of other Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people from all over the country. And we were also hosted along the way by communities. On Invasion Day, we marched through the centre of Sydney in one of the largest demonstrations of sovereignty this country has ever seen. And at the same time, 4 million people lined the harbour to watch replica tall ships sail in all the way from England to reenact this invasion with Charles and Di waving from the decks. And I was really interested in these reenactments of reenactments of reenactments and these symbols of tall ships. And at that time, I was also working at Flinders University, and obviously Flinders is named after a non-Indigenous explorer. And at that time, we had a tall ship as our logo. And I'd spent a lot of time with the marketing departments describing how the tall ship was a problem and we needed to sink it, perhaps. Anyway, so the last time that I was here on Gadigal country with my unbound sister, Seymour, who's in the yellow up here, who is also the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous at Flinders. And this is Deadly Alexis West in the black, who's a performer and poet, playwright, Koori woman from Queensland and South Sea Islands. And Faye Roses Blanche is Yidinji Mabarbram from the Atherton Tablelands, but has lived on Garniata for a long time. But I was here with Simone, and it was the end of 2019, and we were meeting with the Biennale of Sydney, the Powerhouse and Gadigal community for our participation in Mirning and seeking permission and collaboration to perform at a site occupied by the Sydney Observatory. This site is the highest land point, we were told, in the harbour, and is also a place where each day a large ball drops down a pole at the observatory, marking and setting the clocks and time in this place in relation to Greenwich Mean Time. This site also marks a point from which all colonial mapping extends out from this country. So essentially a ground zero colonisation point for First Nations understandings of time and space. I remember wood ash was falling from the sky in between the high rises, and the smoke-filled sky in between the high rises. The fires were burning all over the land. And then we all went into COVID lockdown, and so this performance didn't happen as planned. But our wicked collective problems continue. They persist, and they're not going away now. More than ever, truth-telling understandings of collective responsibility, justice and sustainability should be at the forefront of our minds. I want to acknowledge First Nations elders who have raised us and led our communities, and the deep creative energy of the country, which is beautiful beyond words. The old stories and languages of country are precious and continue to exist despite all attempts to erase them. As is protocol in our communities, I'll explain to you my intimate relationship to the knowledge I will share with you, and these understandings are grounded in my family and our stories. For us, these experiences and knowledge are to be honoured above other forms of research. Our elders and community are our primary knowledge holders, and First Nations peoples are the people who should benefit most from the cultural knowledge production of our communities. My matriarchal family come from the far west coast of what is now called South Australia, spanning over the border into what is now called Western Australia. We are Mirning people of the Nullarbor desert, sea and sky, and my great-grandmother was born at a place called Yerkla or Yukla. My cousins have explained to me how for Mirning it only goes to grandmother, and then the great-grandmother becomes the daughter again. So my responsibilities to my great-grandmother are very important, and they've shaped my life and the work that I've chosen to do. So this is a photo of my family, a beautiful photo. So on the far end this side is my grandmother holding one of my mother's siblings. This is my white great-grandfather, who had 2 Aboriginal wives and married my great-grandmother very late in life. And these are some of my aunties, and this is my nana's brother, just about to serve to go north to the northern parts of Australia, up Darwin, Larrakia country, to fight in the Second World War. This is, and his wife here, my great aunt Rita, and then other family. And this is my great grandmother Gumillya. This was at a time when my mother would describe that chaos had descended on my great grandmother's country. And when I read that history of the violence on the West Coast, I am totally amazed by my family's incredible skills at survival and incredible beauty. I just think they're so incredibly beautiful. My grandfather came back from this war, and really all of my family have not benefited. A lot of my family were forced onto the Kunaba mission, but then there were other members of the family who managed to escape that and lived in kind of outskirts of non-Indigenous settlements. So when my great-grandmother died in the Royal Adelaide Hospital in 1951 on North Terrace in Adelaide, the anthropologist Norman Tyndale came in and cast her face and her chest. And he took her hair and her blood, and these items are held by the South Australian Museum. This was part of a project Tyndale was doing with Joseph Birdsall and someone from the Smithsonian and another anthropologist from Czechoslovakia to record the races of man, and the broader project is well documented in the history of the first 100 years of the South Australian Museum, written by Herbert Hale. This movement of physical anthropology and eugenics are part of the larger landscape of social Darwinism and race science that has shaped so many understandings about race in this country and globally. And while collections of our cultural materials are intimate and can illuminate local histories and truth-tellings, as previous speakers have pointed out so beautifully, some of these collections contained in many museums and university collections also show global patterns of violence and genocide that demonstrate contemporary movements of power, land theft, ownership, unpaid labour, and divisions of wealth and the limits of what we can describe as humanness. In this country, we are yet to see a permanent exhibition or any kind of acknowledgement of how these laws and policies, like in a way that really focuses in on it, have impacted us all. And Adelaide, where I grew up, is one of the global capitals of physical anthropology perpetrated on our old people's bodies. Part of my ongoing work is trying to understand and teach about these ideas and also creatively respond, as many First Nations artists continue to do. And I want to acknowledge all of the artists and community in the room who continue to respond to the ways in which our bodies have been constructed in this country. My grandmother, who you can see on the right here, was born in 1911 behind the sand dunes at a place now called Fowler's Bay, on the edge of the Nullarbor, in a shelter built especially for her birth by Aboriginal midwives. She was sent to work to be trained as a domestic servant at the age of 6 in Fowler's Bay, which was then a ration port because the land had been divided up and given away to the white people to be farmed. So many Aboriginal people were starving because they were being shot if they entered this newly acquired farmland. Nan was sent to work for a white family in Fowlers Bay, as were most of her sisters. She worked as a cleaner and domestic in hotels for most of her life. And her oldest sister, my Nana Ruby, worked for 40 years without a wage as a cleaner for a police officer in Norwood, now a middle-class suburb in Adelaide. And this is what it says on her protector file. These histories of lifetimes of unpaid labour are not well known in this country, even though the history in South Australia, uncovered by my sister colleague Natalie Harkin in her research on the Aboriginal women's labour histories of South Australia, is that white people could not remove enough Aboriginal girl children to meet the demand in non-Indigenous households. Many of these stolen young women would return to the missions and reserves pregnant from working in non-Indigenous households, only to have their babies also removed. What is missing in many discussions of the stolen generations are this indentured labour history as well, and also the accountability of these white families. How are these young women who were forced into servitude getting pregnant and having their children removed again and again under assimilation policies? I was reminded yesterday that these histories of forced labour and exploitation remain largely untold, and for the thousands of students I have taught over the last 23 years, so few understand the extent that these policies continue to traumatise our communities. There is also a great economic impact for our communities because our old people worked all their lives for little or no wages and have not ever been included in the institutions and systems set up to benefit non-Indigenous people in this country. Many of the issues facing our communities relate to issues stemming from intergenerational poverty, entrenched in systemic historical and contemporary racism, an education system that fails to see us and represent us at all levels, a lack of employment opportunities, and intergenerational trauma impacting on our well-being and our bodies. Eve Tuck, beautiful native Canadian scholar, in her conference paper, I Do Not Want to Haunt You, But I Will, describes that in order for cities such as this city and settler colonial institutions like universities and museums of empire to exist required our deaths. And for our families and communities, we are acutely aware of how these mechanisms of settler colonialism continue to attempt to erase us while generating wealth and benefit for predominantly white bodies from stolen land and genocidal laws unleashed upon us. I speak to you as a descendant of people who continue to survive atrocities of public policy and violent law in this country. I teach about these very recent and very violent histories, and we dance between the historical and the contemporary knowledges, asking students to make some important connections. My connections to collections on Kaurna Yarta, Adelaide, are fraught with intergenerational layers of sadness and trauma, which I know have impacted on my body and the bodies of our communities and families that are contained within these collections and spaces. While completing my honours thesis in 1996 and my master's in 2002 and my PhD in 2018, I engaged in the long and painful journey of reading, tracing and examining our local and national histories contained in books and archives, including the South Australian State Records, the South Australian Museum. At various times, this work has made me unwell, and as a remedy to this unwellness and a survival tactic, in 2014, I began to work creatively with my sister colleagues, also working in Yungarendi First Nation Centre at that time at Flinders. Faye Roses Blanche, who's Yidinjima Barbram, Simona Lolkatur, who is Yungwinjara, Natalie Harkin, Narunga, and the Unbound Collective began a collaboration to incorporate performance, our research, teaching, installation, video projection, poetics, song and writing. I would like to acknowledge these sisters and our work together with our extended communities over the last 10 years. In many ways, this collaboration has meant that I could continue with this very difficult work of teaching about race in the university to mainly non-Indigenous people. It has also changed our methodological understandings about the best ways to teach within what are called the disciplines of knowledge in the academy. So what we can see up on the screen here is Act 1 of the Bound and Unbound Sovereign Acts, Decolonising Methodologies of the Lived and Spoken. I had a big title for that first one. And we performed and installed a gallery that jumped from the proposition that Faye and I had kind of read in 1989, Alice Walker's book, The Temple of My Familiar. And in The Temple of My Familiar, there's a chapter which describes a woman who is living in a reconstructed, like, diorama of her actual village from Africa in the British Museum as a living display and the last speaker of her language. And in the book, it describes this kind of capture within the museum and the possibility and our humanness, and in very, very complex ways. And for us, having been teaching our histories in the university for a long time, this work was really about breaking outside of the university to engage with our families and communities who we didn't see in the university space. We wanted to engage with the ideas, but we also didn't want to scaffold students in. We wanted people to be able to bear witness to the work if they could come, if they wanted to, but we weren't going to explain ourselves. We wanted to have complex, inward-facing conversations with each other and our families and communities, number one. And I think part of that demarcation of us needing to have those opportunities to speak to each other in ways that are very much about our own joyful revenge, agency, however we want to describe it. So we were imagining, Natalie and I had been doing a lot of work in the archive, and I'd become very, very upset and almost irate. Like, I couldn't fathom how great the kind of levels of surveillance, the levels of violence, the incredible distress in our communities, and the fact that we were surrounded by people who knew next to nothing about these histories of where they lived. So we overtook this artist-run gallery in Adelaide, and we put a big banner on the roof, which is actually a bit hidden behind our deadly interpreters, but it says occupied and enjoyed, and it's got the Aboriginal flag. And so it did attract actually community members who saw the Aboriginal flag and occupied and enjoyed and just came into the gallery space, right? So occupied and enjoyed refers to the Letters Patent 1836, because South Australia was a province, unlike the penal colony of the rest of the country. It was, you could buy plots of land sight unseen, and it had its own kind of founding document, which was stamped by a representative of the King, which said basically that this occupation will not impinge upon the Aboriginal people or their descendants of this country. And we know that that's absolute, like, wow. Anyway, so that's the founding document. And some Nunga communities have tried to legally test this with in South Australia, but we were just interested in the fact that we are occupying and enjoying a beautiful country. And Faye did a video response to Andrew Bolt called "It's So Hip to Be Black," which is a poem that she wrote. And then we performed in a kind of a cycle. So Simone, who's Yankunytjatjara and comes from a long line of song women and is a performer, sang in Yankunytjatjara one of her mother's poems, and her niece played the violin, which is a dedication to Simone's mother, Auntie Nijiter, Monitor, to Simone's mum's grandfather, and it's called To My Jamal. Natalie did a performance which was talking about attention record keepers of the state. We have you under surveillance, we have you under surveillance. And she is currently in Naarm speaking at another conference, and they've all made T-shirts which say, archival activists, no truth telling without access to our records. Part of the issues that Gay was talking about yesterday in relation to the kind of guarding, the contemporary guarding of some of access to our records are very, very political places that in South Australia have been fraught. And mainly in South Australia, this was due to the fact that it was the only state where a successful suing by a member of the stolen generation has occurred. The beautiful Bruce Trevorrow, who passed away while trying to seek justice for wrongful removal. And the last protector of Aborigines in South Australia, Penhall, who signed all of the documents relating to my family, acted outside of the law. So part of it was that a whole suite of records from the then state records had been moved to the Crown Solicitor's office indefinitely. And so people who might have been able to build a case couldn't do it because they couldn't access the evidence. Cameron Rains wrote a book, a non-Indigenous researcher called The Last Protector, and when they found out what he was doing, they tried to ban him from the state records. So this was all kind of coming out at the time, and I was trying to write about it. And in the end, the best way that I could think of to respond was creatively, because it was so much more joyful and sharing in our community. So we had our elders and our family. We made some shadow films, and we had beautiful smelling gum leaves throughout the gallery, and it was a great thing. That was in 2014. In 2015, at the inaugural Tarnandi, we performed again in the kinds of, in between the South Australian State Library and the South Australian Museum, and we came out of the Flinders University City Gallery, who supported a kind of a platform for us to exit and then perform in between institutions, because part of the work that I'd been thinking about was that the gap isn't our gap between aspiring to be like non-Indigenous people. The gap is the gap between the colonial institutions of power that we fall into. We fall into these brutal cracks in society that allow us to just perish in plain sight of everyone. We see it more and more in our cities. And so we were projecting resistance poetry onto the South Australian State Library, and one of them was me reflecting on my mother's life and the fact that she had no books. And it was one line that said, she could not find herself in any of your books. This building here on the right is one of the oldest buildings on North Terrace. It's behind the South Australian Museum, but it's owned by the South Australian Museum now. It's called the Armoury Building, and it once housed the Colonial Army and their horses to kind of protect the white settlers and push Aboriginal Kaurna people out of the CBD into what is the native location, which was down near the weir, and then further out to Point Pearce and Rauch and Point Macleay. But since it was part of the museum, it became the epicentre of the physical anthropology that I described earlier that happened to my great-grandmother. And thousands of our old people's bodies have been moved through this building and shipped to universities and museums all across the Americas and Europe. And we are still in the process of trying to recover these old people, and people have been doing so much work in the community, this very difficult work. And the South Australian Museum still holds nearly 4,000 of our old people's bodies in its collections. So they've started to do a repatriation process, but part of this performance was really, Natalie described it as thinking about how we could repatriate love to our ancestors. So Uncle Lewis Baker O'Brien, who you saw in the last beautiful slide, he's a Ghana elder and a really important teacher, and has been an elder in residence at Flinders University, and he's 94 now. So he's just retired from his elder in residence. But he's still very active. I interviewed him for our presentation in the Venice Pavilion, the Australia Pavilion, and he spoke so beautifully about change and about the changes that have occurred and what we need to do. So Faye slapped the library, and Simone sang, and we had these incredible skirts on, which were kind of like a cross between a colonial kind of skirt and I was trying to like do a whirly, like a shelter, and then or a wheelchair, but they were also a bit like a cocoon, and when we actually broke out of them, they made this cracking sound. Anyway, we made them out of flour, sugar and tea. We thought it would have been real deadly, paper mache, flour, sugar and tea, and chicken wire, but they got eaten by rats. So we got a bit smarter after that with our costumes, because I was like, we spent so long, and anyway, the rats thought that they were yum. So here we go. She could not find herself in any of your books. So at this time, while we were doing these two performances, we also had these 10 sovereign love poem bus shelters around places where we thought our community might see them, places where our communities live, and so all over the kind of broader Adelaide region. And this is an example of one. It says, "Be still, the silence is waiting. With love, you're on Ghana land." And then this one, which is at the end of the tram line at Glenelg. And behind this shelter, if you looked on the foreshore, there's a big statue memorial to the non-Indigenous explorers and the tall ships. So it was really great that we had this one at Glenelg, and it says, "We are your blind spot, the invisible made visible, the absent made present. With love, we are on Ghana land." Okay, so I've been writing about these a lot. So as part of the first Sovereign Act, so we had these series of Sovereign Acts, so Sovereign Act 1, Sovereign Act 2, the research department started to hate us because it was like they're too similar, the names, but I was like, no, it's just an unfolding, we're unfolding, we have traces of one in the next and then in the next, and we made a big body of kind of, it's about action, it's about being sovereign, it's about being under the Act, the Aborigines Act. And then at that time I started collecting racist texts, and I got given them, they were being thrown out of the university library because no one was borrowing them. I mean, obviously they keep a copy in the repository somewhere, but they weren't on the shelves because they're kind of diminishing the shelves of the library. So they're just being thrown out of the op shops. No one wanted to have a racist text on their shelf. But for me and for all of our communities, these are the texts, the only texts that we could find written about ourselves when I was growing up and when my mum was growing up, before the internet, on the periphery of the colonial outpost of Adelaide, in places named after other places in England. And these texts were like, I started to categorise them, so I've written a little article about the categories of racist texts, because I've been using them as a way to teach about the white canon of Australian history, but they're jammed in, so you can only see the title. So students have to kind of look at them and we can start to kind of glean out just from the titles what they might be about. And I let them know that I've assessed them and I consider that it's my opinion. And it was also around the time that Brandis was trying to suggest that, you know, we had a right to offend, there's a right to be a bigot, free speech, la la la. And I thought, okay, all right. So, and then there were some living authors that I decided I didn't actually want their attention on me, because this was exhibited, it's 8-metre high stack, exhibited in the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, ACCA, as part of, and Paula Bala, my deadly sister, asked me to put this work in Unfinished Business, Perspectives on Art and Feminism, which was really about... Anyway, this work and the kinds of impacts of those, and then the living authors that I decided we would face them to the wall. So we knew they were in there, but they wouldn't necessarily know. But it didn't matter, because it was more about a kind of a poison and a remedy, like a cathartic sense that they no longer had power over me. They no longer could determine my experiences of the education system. And as I said to the university's Education Quality Committee when I spoke to them about indigenising the curriculum earlier in the year with Seymour, I said, this is not where we want to go. All of these texts are written by non-Aboriginal people about our bodies, and the descriptions of our bodies, and the terms and the paternalism and the whole ownership over these histories needs to shift radically. But it also describes what Foucault has described, the slenderness of the narrative. This is just, once you start collecting them, you realise, oh, there's a kind of a spectrum, but sometimes you're just blown out of the water. You're like, wow. And it became something which, instead of having me when I was younger in panic attacks, where I'd feel like I was in an educational environment of threat, where at any time I could be confronted by people who were either supposed to be teaching me or other students about my identity, my relationship to my histories, my relationship to my family and community, and the stories of our communities that were not being represented at all in the university. I did a whole degree where I did not get spoken to by one Aboriginal person as a knowledge holder expert. And I know that there are students at Flinders who are still experiencing this. They're Aboriginal students, our brightest students going into some of the science and engineering degrees, and they're not being spoken to by any Aboriginal people as senior knowledge holders. And that, to me, is a disgrace, because it doesn't reflect the enormous importance of our knowledge holders in this country, the cultural leadership and care for this place that we have provided for so long, and the experiences, the lack of justice and the lack of truth. So people ask me about this idea of truth telling, and I say, well, I don't know if anyone's ready to hear some of these histories. They're so hard to hear. They're so upsetting. I have to spend a lot of time being really, really gentle with all of the students, because I don't assume that anyone doesn't have mental health issues that aren't in an existential crisis themselves. But at the same time, I say to them, well, you're struggling to do this topic. Imagine living this topic. Imagine it being your, so then you can start to imagine the kind of weight bearing that Indigenous peoples are doing. And for me, these need to be, because what's happening in special collections is that the librarians are kind of moving the extremely racist relics into special collections, but we don't know what we don't know. So you don't happen upon racism in the way that I did when I was younger, just wandering through the library, because we didn't have the internet. You had microfiche, and you had, how was I going to find voices? And so you just stumble across books and open them up, and you just go, what is this? Anyway, let's keep going. So, in 2019, early 2019, the beautiful Noongar curator who was at the MCA, Chloe Hill-Bullen, was curating Sovereign Acts. We did Sovereign Acts 4, and it was called Object. And we picked the site. So this has got the deadly Auntie Rhonda Dixon, who gave an important speech and welcome. We had a small campfire and beautiful performers and a ceremony from young men from La Perouse. And this was out the front of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And then we had, Faye and Simone had flown over early to go to La Perouse with Wesley and collect foliage for our skirts, which we covered in local foliage, and they saw the spot that had been cleared, ready for the new statue of Captain Cook. Remember they were going to build that big, what happened to that, I wonder? I don't know, I haven't investigated it. Anyway, they ransacked the Australia Council and we're going to build this massive statue. Anyway, who knows what happened. So they went there and we covered, and then it had to be smoked of all bugs, so that even though it looked like we'd just emerged from the bush, it had been debugged, frozen, who knows what they do, archivists. Yeah, anyway, so we didn't bring any bugs in. Anyway, so we walked in. It was it's an incredible spot. And I think the issues that communities face, but also the amount of emails just to have a tiny fire, a tiny little campfire. I was like, you guys can build a Greco-Roman tomb with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles across the top, the aspirational collection that you want, right? But we can't have a fire, and the guy from the Botanical Gardens is trying to mow over it while we're trying to set up. Anyway, this is the kind of example of how public space is not public and how we acknowledge sovereignty, but we were standing there. Okay, so we smoked, we had a beautiful ceremony, and then we went inside the gallery to the colonial wing, to these creaking floorboards above what was the primitive gallery and is now the staff library of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And we went down to what was the primitive gallery. Who knows what was in there? And we were above, and we projected resistance poetry onto the colonial paintings, the Heidelberg School. I got my revenge for my Year 12 art exam. Me and Tom Roberts, I couldn't believe it. I was projecting right onto the painting, and we had to assure everyone that the light wouldn't damage it. No. Anyway, but the light did change it. It changed it for us. It changed our relationship to that place. And then Simone sang to Captain Cook, a beautiful song by the late Lily Sainsbury. We came back, we did more. We've just done so many performances, and we made these incredible shadow films. So I'm just mindful of the time. I'm going to flip through a few. This is a performance we did at the Migration Museum, which used to be the place where it was one of the Ghana schools where Ghana children were forced to kind of go, but it was also where any Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal women who were unmarried, who were pregnant, had to go to have their babies. But it's now the Migration Museum, and we decided to make skirts like skins of our records, so our protector records, songs of resistance, photographs, propaganda, the works. We had it all on our skirts, our own little collages of our histories. We then collaborated with the incredible FUMA Art Museum and Vital Statistics to talk about those histories, which are national histories of indentured labour, through the Sovereign Sisters domestic work, and I want to acknowledge incredible Ree and Fiona Foley in the room to talk about these histories of, this work here. I remember from art school being really, really happy to see it. Look Who's Calling the Kettle Black, and these photographs of domestic servitude. There was a number, and this was like tracing the national histories of these stories, which are so unknown, you know, for a lot of the people that we're surrounded by, but are so well known for our communities because they're such common stories. And we did a performance as part of that. I'm going to keep going. So my Deadly Sisters have, and I have healed each other in these processes, as well as laughed and cried, sang, danced, written together, and we teach. We teach a lot, and we do a lot of work. The latest work that was shown in Venice, and I know I'm running out of time, is we're thinking about our kind of focus being on environmental degradation, destruction, and so Simone's nanas are all the late Pupapiti Kunkajota, many women of Kupapiti who fought against the nuclear waste dump in the 1990s. And I've just been doing interviews with one of my aunties who was on the Nullarbor when the British let off their nuclear bomb. And she was sitting in a small tree, and she remembers the ground shook, and then for days they sat in like a brown dishwater nuclear fallout, and she's got a big tumour in her throat. So I've been recording her stories of the Nullarbor and thinking about the work that we made for Tarawara, but also for Venice, is about the last pieces of the mangrove forest on Ganiata, which was the largest mangrove forest in the Southern Hemisphere, but was not seen as beautiful by the colonisers. They called it Port Misery, it's all mud. But actually what we now know, the ecologists tell us, is it's a store for enormous amounts of carbon, and the fish nurseries and all of the oxygen that we need comes from the mangrove. So it was being poisoned by the salt fields in Adelaide, and part of the film that we made was really looking at Ghana string making and thinking about slowing down these ideas of progress. I'm also really, I guess some of the takeaways, and I want to return back to some of the thoughts that I've had, is that we should own our cultural materials, and there is no economic infrastructure in our communities. We should not be reliant on fluctuations in political will for funding for our community cultural institutions. Audre Lorde spoke about this idea that the master's tools won't dismantle the master's house. I think the master's tools is dismantling its own house, but I don't want the house to die. You know, this is actually a shared house. The planet is shared, and we have critical issues that we need to kind of move through, but I don't want it to be that the most vulnerable people in our societies are those who will suffer, while those who have hoarded resources all over the planet imagine that they could somehow escape suffering through hoarding inordinate amounts of wealth that they don't need. I think we need to build capacity in groups, not individuals. There is a current report released by the Productivity Commission that examines Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's engagement with arts and culture in this country. And as someone who's chaired Aboriginal community boards, I know that we need to have our own capacity to build our leadership. Through arts and culture languages, we can teach students about all knowledge intersectionally within universities, and there needs to be intersectional kind of knowledge production from Indigenous perspectives where we are collectively together protecting each other. There's no such thing as, like this idea of natural history and the kind of complacency of this idea of natural as an inevitable unfolding needs to be really let go of. We have histories of genocide it's a culturally learnt behaviour. We need Indigenous-led collections. We need to allow, as beautiful colleague, Noongar colleague suggested yesterday, we need to allow emotion and passion into the room. And I often remind students that if they don't feel emotional hearing these histories, then I'm not teaching them right. Interdisciplinarity allows us to work across space. Our old people are always reminding us how things are connected. We need to trust in this for our futures. I often ask students, what does peaceful radical change look like and how can we plan for it? Either we start planning for peaceful radical change and discomfort, or violent radical environmental and cultural change will continue to create communities where the most vulnerable will continue to suffer. Stop branding everything with private companies, in particular mining companies and telecommunication companies. These companies should be investing in communities where they make profits. These companies should be ethical, sustainable and transparent and paying proper tax. Stop asking our elders to do endless welcomes, pay them to be delivering cultural leadership within our communities and fund programs that allow elders to pass on their knowledge to our young people. Too many of our children are in out-of-home care and they need the love and languages and support of our communities. Remember, as Gay Scolthorpe reminded us yesterday, that living cultures are always more important than decontextualised objects. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ali. Very powerful presentation. We just have about 5 minutes for questions. We have volunteers holding microphones in the audience, so if you could just raise your hand and wait for one of those microphones to come to you.
I've got a light shining in my eye.
Yeah.
It's hard for us to see, but yeah. Hi everyone.
Yes, just down here, thank you. Who's got that mic? Microphone, please, down towards the front. It's just for our online audience. It's good to record it.
Thank you so much, Ali. My name's Fiona. You know me because we work together. Really enjoyed, obviously, hearing that, and I know how powerful you are as an educator at our institution. I suppose I thought what might be useful for some of the audience here who are engaged in, obviously with university collections and also that interface of teaching, perhaps just talking a little bit about how you use the collections at FUMA, to teach face-to-face. I mean, you've talked about your own practice and I know that you bring that into class, but we also have this collection at Flinders that you draw on so consistently and amazingly to connect students with those stories and histories. Maybe you want to just reflect a little bit on that.
Thank you, Fiona. FEMA has an incredible collection of 8,000 works, and 4,000 of those works are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander works from across a broad spectrum of time and space across our communities. And we teach every single class in our Indigenous Studies major at some point enters the FUMA collection as a place of joy to witness and see the voices of our communities, and also engage with the complexity of how the personal and the political can be woven together, the historical can be woven together, how they begin to understand what it is they're trying, these big narratives, and then there's the moments of comprehension, and somehow those points of understanding and intersection where they actually bring themselves into the space and are encouraged to have a creative and emotional response. Often they haven't been asked to have creative risk-taking or emotional responses, especially, it depends on what degree they've been doing, but they feel very nervous. But then I say, well, you know, there's no right or wrong here. Just start actually, you know, engaging with those histories. So for me, they're very important. It's so important, and I really value the ongoing work that FUMA does with a tiny staff at the university. And you know, we're small too. We teach all the social workers, all the criminologists, all the Bachelor of Public Health students, all the education students. Got this huge remit of kind of, and they want to know things. You know, they want to hear us, but there's only so many of us. So these collections then also, but I want to see more of our people in the university. I don't want them to be an excuse for not employ. So the employment aspect is big, and the investment in building the knowledges and capacity building needs to be really at the forefront of people's kinds of priorities, because it took 20 years for us women. Like, it's a huge investment. You know, Simone mentioned the other day, it's a huge investment by the university. It was a huge investment from our communities. There's so many things we could be doing with our lives. We're at the university, you know, like, so, you know, our communities have invested in us too, because the knowledges that I bring to the space are often not the knowledges that I've learnt despite the university, not because of it. But thank you, Fiona. I appreciate that FUMA. Yay, FUMA. Anyone else want to say anything? Or I can thank you, everyone. Yeah.
So, well, I would just like to please join with me in thanking Ali again. Thank you for your powerful presentation. You'll be here for the day, so
I'm leaving. I'm leaving this afternoon.
okay.
On the plane.
So grab her at morning tea if you have burning
yeah,
questions.
Yeah.
And just thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank
Ali
you.
Gumillya Baker.